Good afternoon. This is Taryn Nance with the Center for Food and Agricultural Business. I would like to welcome you all to the latest installment of our Tailgate Talks. Today we are lucky to be featuring Rob Dongoski, the Global Food and Agribusiness Leader for Ernst & Young, as well as a 2017 MS-MBA alum, and he will be joined in conversation by Dr. Allan Gray. So I will turn it over to you two.
Thanks, Taryn. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Looking forward to an opportunity to have a interesting discussion with my good friend Rob Dongoski. We've been for full information, Rob and I have been working together for, well, I was going to say full information, Rob, but actually I don't know how long. A while now. It's been quite a while now. Let's see. When would you have graduated from MS-MBA? You probably remember that better than I do.
Yeah, so
in
4 or 5
17.
years.
Yeah, for 4 or 5 years now, we've been working together on a number of different projects in different places, and been on the stage with each other in a few different places as well, talking about these various kind of topics. So let me just give you some quick sort of frame of reference as to why we're on this tailgate and what it is that we're here to talk about. Rob and I and a number of other folks have been on a number of Zoom calls over the last, say, 6 months-ish, talking about a couple of different things around the structural changes happening in the industry, and really kind of pre-COVID, post-COVID, and what is that doing with respect to changes in our food and ag industry. And I would argue, Rob, that, and I think you would too, but that there are a number of things that were sort of changing structurally in our food and ag industries before COVID that probably aren't that much different post-COVID, although I don't think you can use the word post-COVID yet, but since COVID has come along, but maybe COVID sped those things up a little bit for us. In most cases, there may be a few things that are changing here and there, and we certainly want to address the things that we see as, boy, these are really sort of COVID drivers. But by and large, these are structural shifts, I think, that we have been looking at for a while now, but maybe some of them are just simply moving faster coming through COVID. So that's sort of the motivation behind this discussion. And of course, Rob spends a lot of time working with folks in the industry, and his role as the principal lead for the ag business of EY. They've been doing a lot of great things in recent times. I don't know if you've been reading their articles. We sent one out to you to take a read of that Rob's been writing. So he's been doing a lot of thinking in this area, but also works with a lot of the firms that are managing through these sorts of dynamics as we go, as we move forward. So that's the reason why we wanted to get together and have a discussion here between the two of us, and with you as well. Feel free. I want to let you know that feel free that if you have questions, don't hesitate to type them in the chat. I'll be trying to keep track of the chat as we move forward. I have a number of questions that I want to ask Rob to address, and most of those he knows because I gave them to him in advance, but he knows me. I told him there may be a surprise or two of questions that he didn't know were coming. And so we'll kind of go through those, but also if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out in the chat. I'll be sure to get those in front of Rob and see what he's thinking. So let's just open up, Rob, with first, thanks for being here. I appreciate the opportunity for you to be here. Maybe you can speak to us a little bit about, from your perspective, what do you see as these big structural changes that are taking place in the food industry? And particularly maybe put a frame on it in terms of, these are things we saw before the pandemic, things that we still see, and then things maybe you see as differences that the pandemic may be driving.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Gray, thank you for giving me the opportunity to spend the afternoon with you. It's always fun to kind of banter about. Now we have to do it in front of a bunch of folks. So we'll we'll keep it going. But I actually think a lot of what we were looking at. I mean, we really looked at the entire food system well before COVID. I mean, we've been looking at this for the last 2-3 years, and we were forecasting a lot of changes already. I don't think COVID has introduced a whole lot of new. I think you mentioned earlier, I think it's accelerating a lot of things. And in some cases, it's putting emphasis on some areas that maybe wouldn't have gotten the emphasis as fast, like sustainability as an example. So, but I think generally the theme that we were seeing pre-COVID and now definitely in the middle of it is that consumers want to know more about their producers. They want to know more about where their food comes from. And, you know, in many cases, they're actually willing to pay a premium to have that relationship one-on-one with producers. I think that's a big element. I think the other is, you know, innovation has largely happened in between producers and consumers. And now we're actually thinking innovation is going to happen much closer to consumers, much closer to producers. So, you know, that for us, the big question is, if you're what I call a node, if you're a node in between a producer and consumer, are you in the future, are you helping, or are you in the way? You know, and I think that's going to be a fundamental question for a lot of the large companies in here.
Great. So, and I hope, and we're going to get to that issue of the node. Actually, it's probably the place that I frankly have the most passion or most interest in what's happening in those nodes in the middle there. But I want to start where I think you all tend to start at EY, and you've heard me say this before. I'll be a bit debating with you, if you will, a little bit about this consumer issue. So consumer trends are changing. Y'all do a lot of focus on sort of the consumer. I think it's the right thing to do. Where's the consumer shifting, and what does that mean for the food industry? I think y'all do a really nice job with that. But you've heard me say this before. You know, how do we determine how much of this is long-term trend that's going to stay versus fad? That might be one sort of debate way to put this. Another way, and the way I really want to be really put a point on it, is to think about the difference between sort of food as fashion versus food as necessity. And how do you see, Rob, that playing out with respect to, say, you know, the income divide that we also see, right? I feel like a lot of times, hey, boy, this is what the consumer really wants, and they want traceability, and they want everything on a blockchain. And yeah, well, okay, maybe some of them do who can pay for that, but can everybody pay for that? How do you see that? Are we going to have two food systems? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think we have at least two food systems, if not more than that. And I don't know if it's necessarily a whole system, but at the end of the day, segmentation has to really be in the forefront of everyone's mind. So I think completely agree. Consumers who want traceability are willing to pay an extra 10 or 20% to have full, you know, sourceable traceability. You know, they may be one buyer category, but we also have to recognize we still have, you know, almost an eighth of the world who's malnourished and underfed, right? And so I think the need to segment is one thing, but I think you almost have to use artificial intelligence, data analytics, and kind of hyper segment and go even deeper than some of the segmentation we've seen before, and then flush that segmentation all the way back to the producers. So now you're giving those demand signals to producers, so they're producing what ultimately is going to be demanded by consumers. So I think that's a huge element. I don't think it's a fad. I don't think we're going to see everything revert back. I think they're, you know, because we look at it from a generational standpoint, I think the interest of, and just broader spending patterns of, say, the millennial generation, who are actually willing to spend more money on food and less interested in spending money on real estate, as an example. So we see their spend shift, you know, go to more towards food and nutrition, and less from other things. And that actually could create opportunities for folks that are doing some novel things with food.
Let's explore just a little bit further this consumer thing, and relate it, at least from my perspective, to the pandemic issues. One of the things I found fascinating is that it's fascinating, the right word to use in this terrible situation we're in COVID, but I mean, there are some economic phenomenon happening that are kind of interesting, right? So I think we have food expenditures by consumers down something like 35%. But of course, the key to that is that it's really food service, food away from home is down some 45 or 50%, right? Which makes up a big part of the reason why the expenditure is there. And what I'm interested in, Rob, is your take on the idea that how so much of what's been, I think, driving consumer or driving our analysis of consumers is looking at the amount they're willing to spend on food. The question is, can we separate out how much they're willing to spend on food versus how much they're willing to spend on service? And has the pandemic changed the notion of a consumer's willingness to pay related to the service side versus the food side of that. I don't know if you've looked at that data any, but it's one of the things that's been really kind of in my mind lately is the huge differences. We're not paying to go to restaurants, one, because we can't, but two, does that stick around or does that come back?
Yeah, I think, the trend line, again, pre-COVID, now we're in the middle of it. The trend line for the last several decades has been, or at least the last few decades, is really focused on what do consumers, what do they buy? So we've introduced all kinds of different varieties of food on to try to anticipate what they're looking to buy. But we've quickly been shifting the last 5 years, 7 years to, where they buy, introduction of omni-channel. And, do you buy, like you said, away from home, or do you buy grocery over the internet? Do you like to have it delivered? Do you want to click and collect? So it's really gotten into where you buy. And then now I think, we were getting to, and I think it's accelerated, is why you buy. And so in some cases, why you buy from a certain product is not always about it's convenient and so forth, but it's sustainable and it adheres to the values that I agree with. It's those kinds of principles now are starting to come forward. So we've gone from what will they buy to where will you buy, and then now I think we're pivoting to why do you buy as well.
So here's my question as relates to that. I see the same thing, and I think that's sort of the right way for us to look at it. And I don't have an answer, nor am I trying to lead you to one. I'm actually curious as to whether maybe you've seen the information here. But my bias, just my gut says, okay, Rob, yep. But the why I buy and how convenient it is to buy it that way is more often linked, I think, to I can go to particular restaurants who source that way. And if I'm not going there anymore, how good am I, or how much am I willing to absorb the transactions costs of me finding it online, going to the grocery store and making sure that I have that locally grown organic kohlrabi that I can make my salad from right here, as opposed to saying, well, I care about those things and I want to, as long as I can go to my favorite restaurant who does that for me. And I'm a little curious about where that transactions cost part of that goes if we in fact start to do more eating at home rather than away from home.
Yeah, so the big question is, how far back do we go to the 50-50, right? And, do we end up going all the way back to 50% of meals, consumed away from home? I don't think we go all the way back to 50. I mean, but we're nearly, it depends on where you live, but you could be at 90 to 100% today at home, right? So yeah. In Europe, it's different, right? It's more 70-30 in Europe, but how far does that snap back becomes a key element. I think it puts pressure on food service, because food service becomes, they're a distributor in there, supplying a lot of the restaurants. But I mean, the other thing is, you look at the QSRs, the quick serve restaurants, they've pretty much snapped back. So, those businesses are not nearly hit as hard today as, say, fine dining. Fine dining is down anywhere from 80 to 90%, and so, that's probably, again, segmentation of those different kinds of restaurant formats will be important. I think the other thing to look at is the increase participation with CSAs. And so people are now, realizing you don't have to do things, kind of exotically to source your own food. I mean, there's things local to you that you can subscribe to, and we've all gotten used to subscribing. So now subscribing to a CSA becomes a little more normal than before.
Interesting. So let's start our walk back in the industry a little bit towards these nodes. My first question to you, as it relates to these sort of shifts in consumer demands, the segmentation, as you suggested, which I think I'm 100% on with you. We got to think about segmentation. And one of the things I've always told people is that, if agriculture and food, but particularly agriculture, needs to embrace the idea of segments and differentiated demand, rather than saying everybody ought to eat the same thing, because it doesn't make a lot of economic sense to have a flat demand curve. You want an upward sloping one, right? A pretty steep one actually would be better, but that's an argument for another day. But here's what we do know as it relates to COVID. We had segmentation in our food industry. And it turns out that if there's a disruption in one of those chains, it's a disaster, because the flexibility to shift between chains becomes difficult. If we continue to fragment that demand, and then we start creating chains to allow us to produce to this consumer group or that consumer group, is that more flexibility or less flexibility in our food system?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think at the end of the day, what we saw in the pandemic early was the inability to do a last mile pivot. So we had food destined for one place, and at the very last second, it changes, and we just couldn't pivot fast enough. We had a ton of food sitting in restaurants that all got shut down. Those restaurants wanted to give it to food pantries, and they had never done that before. They didn't know how. They didn't know the intake process. So they had to learn how to pivot and then it became too late. So I think this focus more on last mile pivots will be important, and I think that'll provide some flexibility in the supply chain. So I think that's a big element there as well. The other one too, Allan, just so, when we say segmentation, you and I both know, a lot of the seed suppliers, they look at segmenting farmers, they see a segment of one, everyone buys corn, but when do you segment by size of farm, age of farmer, all kinds of different personas you can throw in the mix. That kind of segmentation's got to get robust. And what we've got right now is we have a system that's largely built for scale. It's, in the US specifically, it's one of the most efficient food systems in the world. During COVID early, it bent, pretty far, but it didn't break. But we're still spending less than 8% of our incomes on food. The question, I think, ultimately becomes, when we move to more of a personalized food experience, and we're not that far away. When you look at your watch and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it says, hey, your keto diet says you should have 20 grams of protein right now. And you go, okay. And it says, here's 3 sources and here's 3 places you can get them from. Click, click, deliver it to me. We're not that far away from that kind of personalized food system. The question is if you're built for scale, how do you pivot into that kind of an environment where convenience and personalization becomes the norm?
Right. So one of the things that this whole idea of sort of almost thinking of food as mass customization, which is a pretty hard thing to get your head around when right now we're just mass, not customization in any way, shape, or form. And in most of what we do in our industries, how do we think about the approach that a company might take to figuring out how to deliver in that framework? So I'm really thinking, Rob, in more direct terms here. Do you have to do this yourself if you're going to do that? So you have to basically own it from raw ingredient out to the consumer if you're going to be able to do mass customization? How do you see that working?
Well, I think the big question is less about where does food get produced. I think it's massively important, but I think the bigger question is where does food get processed? Because largely what you're buying at a grocery store, center of the store, is pre-processed food. And I don't mean any negative connotation to that, but essentially it's a convenience factor. Let me pick up a box of cereal, throw it in, throw some milk on it. Boy, I've got breakfast in 2 minutes or less, and the kids are off to school, right? But what happens when you want to take that further and you want to process it more at home? That leaves a gap. It starts to shift that effort away from mass processing to more personalized processing. I think that's the trend line to watch, because then you determine what kind of food do you need for those people who want to process differently.
So some of these trends, particularly these things around trying to deliver to these consumers, thinking about how we change up that chain, those were happening pre-COVID even, and maybe you're changing at a more rapid pace in some ways. You have a particularly interesting, in my judgment, view of the industry because you're working with so many different companies and often those things around deal-making activities. That means that you also have access to or see sort of how the financial community, both the equity side and the debt side, see it. What is, to the extent you can share with us, certainly nothing specific, and you wouldn't do that anyway, but in general, how do you think the financial markets see that trend in food? And cause I've always said, we better watch where the money's going, because wherever the money's going, that's likely what's happening. What do you see?
Yeah, definitely opportunistic right now. Definitely high interest to equity investors, especially, and I don't think that's a whole lot different, but I think, whether you're talking, private equity, commercial banking, venture capital, the food space in general is of high interest. Now, there's obviously a lot of categorization happens inside there, right? And so, a lot of foreign investors have over time shown a lot of interest in land, U.S. farm properties. Is that necessary? That's one category. But I mean, alternative proteins, controlled environment agriculture, those kinds of investments are really good for early stage growth companies and those types of investors. And then, the other question starts to be from an investor standpoint is, how far do you want to go to become operational in your investment? So if you're going to own 500,000 acres of farmland, are you good just owning it and having it fully leased? Or do you want to start to put in more operational measures where you can drive economic benefit down to either whether someone owns that land or leases it either way? I think that's a big question for a lot of investors right now. The other one, just the distribution, question that you asked earlier ties to this investor question as well, because depending upon the industry, and you start with the consumers, where are they going to buy? And then how does that flush back into the system? If we go to shorter supply chains for a lot of our fresh foods, and that's kind of I think shorter supply chains has kind of become a buzzword in the industry a little bit. But, what happens when, grocery says, we're actually going to grow food or sell food that's only grown within 250 miles of our store? Or, they start to actually grow food on their roof or inside their stores. And we're seeing some pilots around that kind of space. So at that point, a consumer becomes a harvester, because they're essentially picking live fruit, or lettuce or what have you. I think those kinds of things are what, investors are trying to take a spin through and say, is that a trend and a fad that we'll let the corporates play with, or is that something worth throwing some cash into?
Mm-hmm. So I may come back to that specific example here in a minute, but I'm curious about, so we can see these, so from my outside perspective, which isn't nearly as close to it as you are, sort of the private equity investments, I can see some flow there for potential high returns. These are high risk, high return kind of things. Let's see, because if these things were to take off, they could be really good. I'm curious about sort of the more institutional investment framework, or even internal monies, right? Where do we see, for example, we've seen this, right? Tyson's investing in some things. How do the incumbent firms, if you were to think of it that way, and their equity capital, where do you see that shifting? Are they going after these high risk things also? Do they show more of a structural shift rather than a structural seismic explosion, if you will? I'm just curious as to whether or not maybe there's some more conservative views of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the investment, kind of thesis for someone like a corporate venture capital firm versus a private equity, the investment theses are so different, and even venture capital, as well. But the challenge is some of these things that seem to be really in vogue, like take plant-based proteins as an example, or we've seen an IPO in the controlled environment space here in the last few weeks, and we'll see another one, here shortly. So when we see those things, the problem is private equity is really interested in them, but none of them are at size and scale that it really gets into the private equity worlds. So we're still a cycle or so away from those kinds of companies maturing, getting to a level that, private equity says, yeah, that fits my investment thesis. I think corporate venture capital continues to look for ways. There's really two types. Either they're looking for ways to diversify their capital and put a little more risk into the market that they couldn't, put in their normal worlds, or they're actually, looking for investments that actually bolt into their big corporate worlds. So they almost use corporate venture capital as a scout, if you will, at times. And so there's
Right.
a couple different ways we see that playing out.
Okay. Well, and this might be a poor way for me to look at it, but one way was, you wrote about this a little bit, and everybody's certainly familiar with it, at least from the retail space. They're putting equity capital into the supply chain itself, right? And in some cases, vertically integrating. Certainly Walmart's has decided big time to move into that dairy space, Costco into the poultry space. I think both of them, if I'm not wrong, are looking into the beef space, right? And thinking about, I'm going to make investments in that chain. Can you tell me a little bit about, what do you see happening there? What are the reasons behind why they're looking at sort of making those? The reason I say that might be related, it seems like it's bolting into their own business in some ways. What do you see as the reasons why they're doing that?
Well, I think, again, I think it could vary. I think Walmart's actually has verticalized around Angus beef specifically already. And you've got Costco and poultry, and Kroger's actually in the dairy world as well. And, many could contend that, some of the challenges we saw Dean and Borden face wasn't so much threatened by the nut milks. A lot of people say, well, the cashews and almond milks actually took their share. I think we saw, some disintermediation there more than anything. When, your largest customers build their largest plants in the world, I mean, naturally the supply is going to come from a different source. So Kroger and Walmart both on the dairy side. Excuse me. I think the other one that's interesting is you look at the Driscoll Berries Plenty deal that just hit. So you're seeing some interesting combinations there, which some could say they look like they were on a headlong path to compete with each other. But I think at the end of the day, the characteristics that when you start to consider verticalization, and one thing I should say is it's not just going to be limited to grocery. We're going to see quick serve restaurants and other fast casual restaurants do the same thing. So they're going to verticalize their own supply, and we have that underway as well right now. But some of the things I think the drivers, one is quality. I think definitely quality, and it's always that quality versus costs, kind of trade-off. I think traceability becomes really, really important going forward. So I think that's one. I think consumer demands, consumer trends that want chemical-free, local, that kind of, mentality becomes a major driver. And then I think, again, just the shorter supply chains, are there opportunities to cut costs through shorter supply chains and at the same time give consumers what they want, which is more local? Again, goes back to what we said earlier, Dr. Gray, is that segmentation becomes key, so don't want to imply that the low cost consumer is always going to seek the things that we're talking about here.
Yeah, so Rob, I try to simplify that vertical integration thing down to, and probably oversimplify it in some ways, but in the end, it's a make versus buy decision, right? And if I think about it from the standpoint of it boils down to a make versus buy, and we've got a lot of big players deciding I'm better off making this than buying it from the market. What does that say about the market's ability right now to understand what's happening in the market, in the consumer trends, the customer trends, right? Because the customer is the retailer, and then the consumer trend is the person that they're trying to deliver to. What do you think that says about our was it a signaling issue? Is it a defiance? Is it ignoring the signals, or possibly are these retailers, these folks that are doing the vertical integration, are doing bad math?
Well, I think there's a third option, and I think there's make, buy, and there's partner. And I think the other question is, if you are one of those large retailers and you want to get closer for quality, traceability, and things that we talked about, do you have to necessarily go into a make category? So maybe you don't do spot market buys, maybe you don't also vertically integrate the entire thing. Can you start to create smaller consortiums of producers that are essentially your primary source in certain regions? And so, pick any food category, lettuce, tomatoes, dairy, whatever. Do you see the almost decline of some of the larger institutions in some of these spaces? Is that more of the issue than it is verticalization? Because we do it in some cases, like potatoes as an example. I mean, there's a few large players, and I think some of those large players are competing for supply. So I think there's there's a number of reasons. I think a lot of it depends on the category.
So, okay. So Rob, help me. I'll just put a fine point on this one, and you may know more than you can share here, but I mean, come on. Costco thinks they can somehow process poultry cheaper, more efficiently, more effectively than Tyson. I mean, are we sure that's not bad math?
Well, think about it. I mean, I don't know the math on that, so if I did, I wouldn't get into it, right? But yeah,
right.
Costco poultry is producing one bird, one type of bird, and that's it. Tyson's going in a lot of directions. They're doing strips. They're doing, whole breasts. They're buying some of their chickens. They're growing some of their chickens. They're fully integrated back to the embryo. I mean, there's a lot of things in that whole system that you go, boy, if maybe Costco said, I'm just going to do what I need and do it better than anybody. And I think their big play was really quality, and so they're growing that bird to a certain size, and it's going in the same direction every time. I mean, it's essentially one process instead of, dozens on the Tyson side in that example.
So Rob, our good friend Zeryl's asking a question related to this. In fact, directly related to Costco and chicken as an example. It's just an example, but he's asking, Is this corporate integration thing, is it resilient? How do you think about resiliency, particularly when we see the sort of things we've seen in our supply chains up to this point?
Yeah, the resiliency question. I mean, I've seen the word resiliency more in the last 3 months than probably ever before. I mean, I think it's a great question, Zeryl. I mean, if you do have only one system producing it, I mean, the question is, what if it breaks, right? And I think that we're seeing that in kind of, I think, a bigger context when you look at the traditional meat industry. When you think about, 70 to 85% of our meat goes through 4 companies, and I think 65% of all meat goes through 15 plants in the U.S. So in some ways, that bottleneck we saw in spades during, just a few months ago. But I think the resiliency question is a really good one. I think one of the things in the inventory side of things is we're moving away from just-in-time inventory to just-in-case. And so we're starting to see higher inventory levels for certain things to carry that kind of that resiliency theme forward too. Much harder to do in perishable food than it is toilet paper, but.
So, as it relates to that, Rob, one of the things that I find interesting about it, certainly not to the degree we just experienced over the last, since March, when we had such huge disruptions in the industry, but it's not the first time. I mean, avian flu really messed up the egg industry. But did we learn anything from that, or in the end, do we sort of have short-term memories on these shocks and long-term memories on it's just got to be made efficient and get costs down?
Yeah, and I have a global perspective, right? And so it's, from what I've seen in the U.S., I mean, it's the first time that probably at least 2 generations in the society today, at least 2 generations. First time I ever went to the grocery store and didn't see something on the shelf that they needed. It's always there. And it was a shock factor when it was paper towels. It was more shocking when it was meat, and then we were rationing meat. Step outside the U.S. and go into some other countries and you go, well, that's just normal. We know in certain communities that chickens come in on Tuesday morning. If you don't get there on Tuesday, they're gone by Wednesday, right? So, I mean, to some degree, it's like, this is not only the most efficient, but in many ways, compared to other countries, it's also one of the more resilient systems in the world as well, when you think of it that way.
Yeah, no, that's true. Resiliency does have some sort of a baseline to it from what your expectations have already been set at. That's true. I know when I spent my 9 months living in Brazil, the chickens that you're talking about that Costco is focused on making, which is their broiler chickens, their whole broiler chickens. In Brazil, you get those on Sunday. That's it. They're called TV chickens, and that's the time you can get them, and you can't get them the rest of the week. And I was always disappointed because I have them a couple of times a week. I like those chickens that they have at Costco, and so, but you had to adjust yourself in Brazil. That happens on Sundays. That's it. That's when you get those particular chickens. So one more question as it relates to sort of this decision making, this make versus buy thing. Again, sort of in the realm of fad, but not really a fad. I think of this one more as like, do you think this is potentially a cycle? So I sent you the question earlier. My good friend Mike Bolge, who I see is on here with us too. He's the one who got me to think about this a few years ago. We were talking about this and said, in the automobile industry, this is nothing new. They've vertically integrated probably 4 or 5 times in their history now, where they sort of separate out, all the parts get made by independent companies. And then after a little while, they end up vertically integrating those things again. They sort of reset standards, reset quality requirements. They get everything sort of set up. Then they spread them back out again. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, this was the one question I was hoping you were going to skip over, because I didn't have a real great thought around it. Now I know it came from Dr. Bolge. I'm even less surprised. No, I mean, I think my candid thought to it was, I think it's too soon to tell. and that sounds like a kind of a diplomatic way out answer, but I just think it's too soon to tell. I mean, I think on a number of things we're dealing with right now, it's too soon to tell. I mean, we don't know a lot of the stuff that's going to happen, post-COVID. I mean, we don't know when post-COVID is, right? So I think on some of the verticalization, I think it might be a little too soon to tell. But I think when we look at what's happening with grocery is an interesting one. And when we look at where we think grocery will end up in developed economies in say the next 10 years, is there's actually two formats. It gets split into two. So, one format is what we call a live store, which is where you find your fresh. And the other format is a dark store, which is essentially center store items that, you click and collect or, deliver to you in 2 hours or less. When you think about those two systems that get built, if that happens, then verticalization becomes a mainstay on it, particularly in the live store kind of environment, because, and I'm assuming also that consumers will continue to value local food, locally sourced more than they do other. So I think in that sense, I tend to think it'll have some stickiness to it, but I also think we're a little too soon to tell.
I'm glad you brought that one up because it reminds me of the question or the comment I was at least going to have earlier, this idea of the live store. By the way, I really like that concept, and we see more and more of that. I mean, the value, most of the value in the grocery stores is around the periphery. It's not in the center of the store anymore. It used to be. It's not there anymore anyway. So there's a lot of that we think about. One, the margins aren't there in that space anyway, and two, probably the least healthy of the choices is in the center of the store, generally speaking, from a consumer health perspective. So there's a lot of reasons why that makes some sense. But this idea that these grocery stores are going to grow on the roofs or in other places around there and let the consumer become the harvester. My comment to you was, I've lived in Indiana for 21 years. I've planted sweet corn about 18 of those 21 years. If that's what I'm depending upon, I'm going to starve to death. I'm not good at it at all. But I think, I wonder whether or not, Rob, there's anywhere near enough both learning economies and comparative advantage to have local really be something that can be economically feasible in the long term.
And it may be a case we see segmentation in grocery. We've already got it to some degree. You may not find that in Aldi's, but you find it in Sprouts, and so there could be some variation there. I think Whole Foods is already doing some growing on some of their roofs. I can't remember if it's Bowery or Gotham Greens. One of them, I think, actually grows on the roof of some of Whole Foods. I know I have some large corporate clients that they grow a lot of their own leafy greens on their corporate campuses, and so I think it's not going to be for every category. I think the other thing is consumers want local, they want fresh, they want no preservatives, all natural foods. What hasn't come really to light in that yet is when you live in Minneapolis, you don't get fresh apples in January, if you really want to go down to a no preservative route, and you want local supply chains and so forth. I don't know if that fully will work. I don't know if people will snap back on that and say, well, I didn't mean everything,
Yeah.
So I think time will tell on that.
Right, Bob. I've always said the first time that you can buy a locally grown pineapple in North Dakota, I want to see it, because I just don't think that's likely, but there may be some folks in North Dakota who like pineapple. The other thing is, I just came back just today from Yuma, Arizona. And Rob, there's just no replacement, as far as I can tell, for nature's greenhouses. I mean, that place and the valleys of California are naturally designed to produce healthy, fresh vegetables. And we have a system set up to send them to New York, because they'll grow in January and February beautifully in that environment to ship it there. And those things are from a pure economist perspective, pretty tough to figure out how to outdo that math. And It probably hits home to me more once I'm there, once I'm sitting in that garden and going, holy cow, look what they can do here. It's unbelievable. Right.
Yeah. There's no underestimating the value of natural resource, right? Or natural capital, if you will. But one of the things that COVID's done as well is it's raised the food security topic higher on the national security agenda for a lot of countries. So you look at certain countries that export a lot of their food, they're asking, if we have another pandemic, should we be exporting this much? Are we doing a disservice to our citizens at that point? And then on the flip side, you see countries that import an inordinate amount of their food. They're asking the same question, just a little bit differently. So you take a place like the UAE or Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where they import 80 to 90% of their food. The question is that a vulnerability from a national security standpoint? And if you can replicate that environment inside, now maybe not at scale, maybe it's not everything, but if you can replicate that inside with the right amount of capital, we now have HVAC systems that are efficient. We have energy that's efficient. We got LED lighting that's efficient and done right. I think the question is can they compete? Now, do I think that an indoor environment in the desert and in Saudi Arabia is going to compete with the Central Valley of California? No, but it may create a different system there that affects others, in that region. So I'm a little bullish on the whole controlled environment space right now.
No, I get it, Rob. I think that's interesting from the standpoint of to the extent that there's a set of risks in your supply chain combined with a set of preferences from a set of consumers, that you may have a market for a more expensive product, that there's a group willing to pay the premium either to reduce the risk and or to have a choice that they would prefer to have. I think there's an opportunity in that space to say pure cost-driven economics that drives down the cost is probably ignoring a couple of things. One would be UAE says, well, I can't take the risk of depending on other countries for the food for my people. In other places, you say there is a group of consumers in Chicago who says, I will pay a premium for that broccoli grown under glass in Chicago than so that I can have it local rather than having to buy it from the Central Valley of California. I can see where there's clearly those spaces there, but I think in the end, it's still, in the end, there is a math equation there that says how much risk premium am I willing to pay? How much consumer premium is there out there to extract for these sorts of things? And that I simply don't subscribe to the idea that we're going to overwhelm the Central Valley and we'll just stop producing fruits and vegetables in those places. Seems highly unlikely to me that part's going to happen. Instead, we're going to have these separate markets that allow for these things to happen, right?
Completely agreed. I mean, I think at the end of the day, that we're talking about more demand of those types of foods. And so we need more supply, right? I think the other thing to think about, Dr. Gray, is we're seeing the convergence of food and health more now than I think we've ever have. And do we start to see that, kind of economics play out where, I mean, today, I think the number is we spend 10 times more money trying to figure out new pharmaceutical research than we do food research. So the essence, we spend more money fixing people than feeding people. Well, we've proven that if you eat nutritiously, you actually can avoid certain health risks. That actually lowers the health cost burden in a country. I don't want to touch the third rail of subsidies, but do you start to see some frameworks that emerge that can drive that kind of behavior too?
Right. And of course, one of the things that helps drive that behavior in any one of these areas is still this idea of access to capital. And I want to go back to that for a second and relate it to these ideas of these investments in sort of vertical chains. One of the things that Dr. Bolge, I think, would tell us, he used to tell me all the time, was that vertical investments are not diversification. They're actually doubling down on the risk, because you don't diversify away your risk by getting more invested in the same chain. And so the question is, where are the capital markets on this? Are they bullish on putting their money into these vertical arrangements? And are they worried about the risks associated with being so heavily focused on any one industry? Tell me what the view of that is from your world.
Yeah, and I mean, most of the verticalization we've seen has been really contained within the corporate structure, right? So it's a Walmart investing or Costco or what have you. So I haven't really seen a whole lot of opportunities for outside capital. So, I mean, the only place you really start to see it is when you look at the the controlled environment folks, if you want to put that in the category, that's the, Plenty obviously is probably the headline there. Then you saw App Harvest IPO recently. Like I said, you'll see another one, probably here pretty soon. So, if you want to consider that part verticalization, I think there's room for outside capital. Most of it, I think, has been corporate capital to this stage.
And I was curious about that too, as you were mentioning there about, sort of the third world countries' ability to feed others. And they've always talked a great deal in places that I've worked in, places like Africa, about more verticalization sort of stuff. Do we see sort of the capital markets that invest in that sort of development activity, the development banks, are they interested, willing to invest in those sort of vertical types of arrangements in those areas?
I haven't seen it as much, candidly. I mean, the Africa, equation is, that's a whole nother, tailgate talk, right? And so,
Right.
it's always reminding one of my colleagues, Africa is not just one country, right? And so it's the Africa equation can vary by 54 times with all the countries there, right? And so, but I have not seen a ton of capital flow into that area right now. The other area that I think continues to be a big, opportunity that doesn't get necessarily invested in is food waste. And right now there's not a lot of incentives, that are evident that say, hey, let's double down innovation on food waste because there's some sort of economic return there, and so that's the one that I kind of continue to struggle with, thinking, there's got to be an algorithm in there somewhere that says this is a worthwhile investment area.
Yep. I got a couple questions in the discussion. One is from Aslan Spalding. She said, can you explain what insufficient ecosystem partnership means with respect to barriers to transforming the business model? What would be a good example for a sufficient ecosystem partnership?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I would tell you what we're seeing when we think about ecosystems and partnerships. What we're seeing and what we're working with some clients on is we try to get as efficient as we can in our own little space, our own actor set in the value chain. So if I'm food manufacturer, let me get really good at food manufacturing. And what we're seeing now more than ever is people are looking right and left in their value chain. They're saying, that's that make, buy, and its partner. How could I have better collaboration with folks that are either +1 or +2, -1, -2 from where I sit in the value chain? So when that ecosystem really works, you're squeezing out excess costs, not to the detriment of somebody else, but you're actually getting cost. You're not just shifting the profit pool, but you're actually getting costs all the way out of the system where those profits can rise for all.
I think, Rob, this was a while ago now. I had done some research in this area as we were looking at the verticalization of the pork production market, right? The verticalization of hogs from genetics all the way out through processed pork, right? And there's a tremendous amount of sort of cost taken out of the system as they vertically aligned that pork system. I think the same thing happened in poultry during the time that they were doing it. And so there are opportunities for coordinating that. And of course, some of that was an ownership model at first, but has really kind of, again, sort of disaggregated with respect to ownership models and have various stages of the activity that are done in more of a partnership type of activity now. And so there are evidence of those things that have happened where that ecosystem and the economics of it drive it such that it makes more sense to be more aligned there. Zerrell has a question for us too. Another question for us. His questions are always the hard ones. Do you see a post-COVID trend? Do you see a post-COVID trend away from loss leaders? His view, and I see where he's coming from on this, corporate integration seems to have focused on loss leader products, as it's pretty hard to get good supplier alignment in places where, at the retail level, you may be kind of using it as a loss leader, but in the back in the chain, they need the profitability to be able to do it. Do you see us going away from that, or how do you see that working?
And I assume we're back to the Costco chicken as the loss leader, right? It's in the back of the
probably the argument, yeah.
Yeah.
Or the milk, or milk too, right, Rob?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
Milk has often been thought of that, yeah.
Yeah, it's, again, I think you're right. Zero Last's always the toughest questions, but I think as we continue to evolve to understand what consumers ultimately want, we're going to have to, redefine, do loss leader products, matter, or if you're in an online world, or you're in a click and collect world for your food, loss leaders don't really matter. I mean, there is no back of the store in that environment, right? So I think it becomes less important. I think the other one to look at in the whole kind of change that we're thinking about is when does direct to consumer really start to disintermediate a lot of folks in the system, and Pepsi is, right on the forefront from what I've seen. Pepsi, they went live with their direct to consumer model right at the beginning of COVID, and the question asked of them was, particularly on the food side, not on the beverage side, but on the food side, the question was asked, hey, is this just to help people during COVID? They said, no, this is our new way of doing business. So I think, what we're going to step back here in 5 years, 7 years, whatever, is we're going to be amazed at how much direct to consumer is going on compared to what's going on today. So it's not a little off the stray of Zero's loss leader question, but I think once you move to more online buying, I think that becomes I think that has a huge impact on the loss leader question.
Sort of a model of the past in some ways. The next question I have for you, Rob, comes from Mike Bolge, and this is sort of the business model of the future, maybe, but close to being on top of it. So don't be nervous. I think you can handle this one from Mike. He gives you a softball. Of course, I'm teasing you about that. What are the implications of the industry convergence between nutrition industry and the health pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah. Again, I think some of that becomes ingredient formulation for one. I think we need to think about where that happens, but I mean, ultimately on the nutritional side, I mean, if we just focus on the consumer trend, what consumers will tell you broadly, not just with food, but just broadly, and again, that segment of the consumer we're thinking about is they want a chemical-free world. They don't want chemicals in their fabric. They don't want chemicals in their food. There's a general belief that all natural is going to be the healthier environment. So if that's the case, you end up staying more into folks who know how to deal with natural products than synthetics. So it keeps you out of the pharma world and puts you back more in the food world when you think about this nutrition question. I think the other thing is I would keep an eye on technology in this space. Folks that are running very complex artificial intelligence, machine learning. And I mean, think about a world that, you move to a quantum computing environment where the processing becomes so fast and so informative. I think you could see some really, really interesting players that come out that we may not have thought of even in the space. So I think a lot in the air in the next decade, I'm sure.
It's a fascinating area. So many of these things happening in the food industry are fascinating things to be thinking about, and the implications, as you said, Rob, so many of the questions I'm asking you and that you and I have debated over time, we don't really know what the outcome of those things are going to be, right?
I mean, think about,
but it's good to
think about pretty wild on plant-based protein right now with the Impossible and Beyond, right? And, for one thing is you feel better because you're eating plants. Look at the nutritional facts. Some would say you're not eating healthier than your traditional counterpart. But the other side, if you think of it, we've had plant-based protein around for 15, 20 years or more, right? It just didn't taste very good. And so it's not like it's a really, really, brand new concept. And then the other side of it is you think about the purpose of some of those companies isn't the same as the original Boca Burger, let's say. I mean, if you look at Impossible's goal and their mission purpose of company is to rid the world of animal production agriculture, and I think that's an interesting, reason to be in business, and then, and kind of the way they're moving that company forward.
Right. So all these different things going on and in the world and at your firm, you've sort of embarked on a pretty ambitious activity here. This something that you're calling the EY Innovation Studio, sort of an engagement of the industry overall. Can you tell me a little bit about, what is this project? What was the motivation behind it? And can you share anything about what you've been learning so far?
Yeah, so first off, it's the first time we've created a studio specifically for an industry. So this one's EY Innovation Studios for the food system specifically. We've got about 50 different clients that take part. They are allowed to bring in 3 people to each session. So, we'll have anywhere from 120 to 130 client participants on each of these, and it happens every month. And then there's some pop-up sessions that are focused on certain topics. But the reason we did it was, one is we wanted to get the right people in the room to have conversations about the food system, folks that we thought could really move the ball forward. Secondly, we wanted to provoke the right conversation. So if we are thinking about shortening supply chains, let's look across the value chain in the room and talk about what's that going to mean for each of us. And then lastly, we're trying to get away from everything just being a talk, and we're trying to drive some real action. So we're trying to pair up people or clients that frankly can get together and go forward together. That's the why we created it. Here's what we're finding. It seems obvious that you call your neighbor and say, hey, how can we collaborate? It doesn't happen routinely in the industry. We're so focused on optimizing our own vertical that we're not necessarily looking right and left, or even all the way down to each end of the value chain to figure out what can we do. So we're getting lots of folks saying that, man, this is great that I'm a grocer and I'm talking to people who plant potatoes. Never thought I'd ever have that conversation. And here's the 5 things I learned. So we're seeing that happen a lot. We're also seeing there's just plenty of ideas and opportunities. Folks more than anything are getting into a case of too many, and you got to prioritize. So we're running we've been at this for about 3-4 months now, and we're going to start to help think through. Let's get a few things kind of launched and in kind of off the ground here pretty soon. But those are the big learnings. That's kind of why we put it together.
And you said about 30 of your clients across the industry it was sort of your client base originally, but that's a client base that covers pretty much the whole spectrum of the industry. Is that true?
Yeah, it's 50 clients, and if you think of, there's about 8 to 10 primary actor sets across the value chain, and we've got representation from all those actor sets. So if we threw a question out like, what would it mean to trace food from a QR code on a consumer's phone all the way back to a producer, we've got representation across that whole value chain to have that conversation. We're also getting ready to launch the same thing in Europe, and then our intent is probably to let them run kind of European for a while, and then we'll think about the times to connect the Americas and Europe on some of these topics as well.
Good. Well, I will share with you. I've been a part of those when I can be. Can't make it to all of them, but I've been a part of them. They've been fascinating to me as well to visit with folks in the industry. And really, it is about this sort of interactions where there's not presentations. There are some presentations, but there's a lot of interaction around how do we address these sort of issues. And I think that's really been fascinating. The last one, I happened to be a part of the food manufacturing piece of it. And I found that one fascinating. I'll just share quickly with the group kind of what I found from that group listening in and visiting with that was exactly what you just said, was that, boy, they were really stretched to think about what happened before it got in their factory and what happened when it went out of their factory. Those are the places they felt were the most important places to focus their attention was on those areas, but that they kept saying, all we've ever really done is look inside the 4 walls of this food manufacturing plant, and looking outside of it to think about what happens on the other side are things that we need to start doing, but we really don't even know for sure how to do it, right? So I found that comment from them, Rob, really fascinating, because we talk about where the consumer's headed and we've got verticals and we see people starting to do this, but we also have a lot of people blocking and tackling in the industry who haven't really thought much about where is this going outside of what they're doing in their own little world. And I think that's one of the things that you provided us in that article you sent, was a challenge to say, folks, let's be careful about running with our head in the sand or our head down and only just focus on optimization, because you're going to look up one day and this might not be the industry that you thought you were competing in anymore. Yeah.
Well, and you look at the trend line on some of these things, we're on a verge of platform businesses on many, many levels. If you look at, a lot of businesses that we knew when we were kids, I was, thinking about lumber. You know, when you think about when we were kids, you go to the local lumber yard, and now you're down to kind of Home Depot and Lowe's and a couple others, you know, so there's these platforms you kind of circle around, you know, and you think about food, it's going to be the kind of the same way. Take, you know, when you went and bought a mobile phone 15 years ago, before you left your house, you asked the question, do I want a flip phone? Do I want a camera? Do I want this? Now your question has nothing to do with the features of that phone. The question is, am I on Android or iOS? So which platform am I on? And when I get to the store, I'll figure out feature functionality. The question is how many platforms emerge in food? What's the hub of that platform, and how are all the spokes going to connect to it? And I think it's, you know, we've got it up and down the value chain. It's kind of competition for platform.
That's fantastic and a great way to wrap us up, Rob. For everybody that's online, we're going to have even more of these discussions moving forward. We have our Purdue Food and Ag Business Executive Summit. Rob's on a committee with me and Zerrell Gray, actually. Together, we're working on more in a particular session around this topic, plus a number of case studies we're going to be writing that are dealing with these sorts of issues as well. If you're interested in that, go to the Center for Food and Ag Business website, register for the Purdue Food and Ag Business Executive Summit. I think it'll be a lot of fun to have this group, have a group of folks together, about 55 of us in a room debating these issues even further. Rob, can't thank you enough. In fact, what I'd like to ask is everybody who's still online here, if you would, unmute yourselves for just a second. Everybody who would, please unmute yourselves. Let me see how many people I can get to do that real quick. Unmute. And let's give Rob a hand for spending time with us. Thank you, Rob. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Gray, again, thank you for allowing me to take part. Certainly what we've covered in the MS-MBA courses over the last couple of years, and hearing you and Dr. Bulgy both on the line today, I mean, a lot of these concepts are coming to reality that we talked about in theory. So it's certainly brings it full circle.